Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Baltimore City Board of School Commissioners Policy Committee meeting. Today is December 18, 2018. We're going to start our discussion on policy DJA, procurement.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Jeff Parker, Director of Procurement for the school system. I have a brief PowerPoint presentation that highlights the changes that we're proposing to be effective January 1st, 2019. As you know, we have two applicable references. The first is DJA, which is the procurement authority or the policy. One proposed change is made in that section. The administrative regulations, DJARA, there are 4 proposed changes for the board's consideration to procurement and 1 proposed change as it relates to the MBE program. And as stated earlier, we're proposing these be effective January 1 of the coming year. Thanks. As it relates to the policy, let's see, there we go. What's been added is paragraph D. It's a requirement that the board comply with federal laws and regulations as it pertains to recent legislation passed during the Obama administration as it pertains to procurement. This is a requirement that city schools comply with those regulations. There's, for example, these regulations require that when we're spending federal dollars over $150,000, that we're required to do a competitive procurement. The regulations also require that if there are more restrictive regulations in place, that we abide by those rules. The city schools procurement regulations as they stand and as they are proposed are more restrictive. So they apply. As it pertains to the regulations themselves, effective October 1st of 2017, the state of Maryland increased the competitive bidding requirements from $25,000 to $50,000 for all state procurements. City schools' current limit is $25,000. What we are requesting is the board raise that threshold for competitive bidding to $50,000 to be the same as the state's requirements. Our regulations also pretty much speak to $25,000 for any change. So if we were doing a change order to a contract and that change order was over $25,000, we would have to go to the board and ask their approval, as we do with facility change orders and things of that nature. What we're proposing in this instance is to revise that requirement as well to $50,000. And then the other requirement that we have is for any professional service agreement that we draft. The current regulation says that if it's over $25,000, we have to draft a professional service agreement or a contract. We would request the board's approval to also increase that requirement to $50,000. As it pertains to Edgar, as I mentioned earlier, on July 1, 2018, those regulations became effective, essentially increasing the small purchase or micro purchase threshold from $3,500 to $10,000. What that means is prior to the board approving these changes, city schools was required to get additional quotes, 2 or more, for any procurement over $3,500. What we're asking is that apply to now $10,000. And then next page. Great. The last change as it pertains to the MBE program, the state of Maryland, as you may know, Baltimore City Schools complies with 2 MBE programs depending upon the source of funding. It's either the city of Baltimore's, in which case the city is providing the majority of funding, or the state of Maryland, when in most cases it's construction. The limits for the state of Maryland as well as for Baltimore City have been raised to $50,000, at which point we're required to review the procurement for MBE participation. So we would request the board's approval to increase this threshold also from $25,000 to $50,000. And that summarizes the majority of the changes proposed. It's my understanding we would have 3 readers regarding the policy change, and that would commence with the next board meeting.
So Jeff, and you said that the policy of changes will take effect January 1. We need to vote on that first, but we're not meeting before the 1st of January.
Okay. So we could make it February 1st. I wasn't aware that that had to happen, but anyways.
It was a question I was asking. I didn't know. So in order for us to approve the policy change, the board needs to vote on it.
Well, it needs to go to the, it needs to go to the full, sorry.
It's scheduled to go to the full board after this, correct?
Correct. It's my understanding that we would have 3 readers, so it would be
Yeah.
the next meeting, then
That's February, I think.
then finally the last one would be in February.
But I agree with Commissioner McFadden that the implementation date should reflect when the board's going to actually be able to vote on it.
Absolutely. Yeah, we can make those changes to be effective March 1st.
Thanks, Mr. Parker. A few other things. Commissioner James Hassan, in her absence, sent a few notes, and she is thinking about on page 21, number 22 in the regulations, to potentially add a letter E. It could be a place to add an idea, like in the event of a tie bid, in-kind academic services will determine the winner, or something along those lines. I think her point is leveraging contracts that go through the procurement process to better serve the diverse needs of the students that exist in Baltimore City.
All right.
In the regulations also, general question, what is the difference between, or what is the difference in procurement policy and regulations between district and school-based purchases?
So if I understand the question correctly, the procurement policy and the regulations apply to schools equally as it does to North Avenue.
Mm-hmm.
So if a school wishes to make a procurement over $25,000 currently, that procurement would be placed on hold until we had a chance to review the procurement and determine whether or not we have another provider of those services or whether or not we have to do a solicitation specifically for those services.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Could the procurement evaluation tool be formatted in a rubric?
So what we have is
No.
we have 2 different tracks we run down when doing a procurement. We have the procurement when the specifications are well defined. In other words, we're purchasing food for the school, milk, types of products, computers. So when the school can develop very specific specifications, we would issue a competitive bid, and the results of that bid are awarded to the vendor that is most responsive and offers the lowest price.
Mm-hmm.
For those procurements where we're contracting for services, typically, IT services, consultants, educational programs, et cetera, a rubric is created. The rubric, rates the vendors in terms of who offers the best program, and that is offset by who is offering the price, and the price is ranked from low to high. And then what the evaluation committee does is they make a recommendation based on the proposals and the rubric and the price to the board as to the vendor that they think offers the best value. It does not necessarily mean the best price, though.
Mm-hmm. And what do you mean by the best value?
So the best value is in terms of vendor may be providing additional services. So they might be doing a technical evaluation and the vendor's providing additional services. They may have additional qualifications. They may have additional certifications. They may have better references, things of that nature. They may have a shorter timeline to implement. So rather than 6 months to implement an IT solution, they can do it in 4 months. However, the cost to do that might be $300,000 higher than the next lowest price. So the evaluation committee would take those types of things into consideration before they finalized a recommendation.
With the state requirements for MWE, the language meeting state requirements for MWE when appropriate seems like it could potentially be a way to get around meeting the expectation. So if we do not get appropriate representation in the bidding process, could an item be added to the criteria for decision-making that companies who are awarded contracts but do not meet the minimum standard ensure that any subcontracting that they do includes MWE?
So what we do when we do a procurement, and it's a procurement for $50,000 or more, and it's a state procurement, and then what we do is we ask the MBE office to provide us with guidelines based on that procurement. So if it's construction, typically those goals are 27%, 10%, and 7%. Different categories, but essentially that's how they break it all up. And so all the vendors are required to respond to that requirement. I'd say our compliance with construction projects is quite high, like over 95%. We get total compliance with construction contracts. To your question about what if, in those situations, what's required of the vendors is that they provide us with documentation demonstrating that they have actually done best efforts to accommodate our goals. So we have specific situations, let's say we're purchasing computers, where 90% of the item that's being bought is the actual computer. There's minimal opportunities to subcontract outside of the purchase of the computer itself. In those instances, those goals would be low, let's say maybe 4% and 2%. The vendors would respond, and the vendors could respond and say, we can't meet those goals. Or the vendor could respond and say, we can do 2% and 2%. And here's our documentation, and this is how we arrived at our conclusion that this is the best we can do. Those requirements are reviewed by the MBE office to determine if they are in good faith. If they provided adequate documentation and they are in good faith, then we would typically go ahead and make a recommendation to the board that they approve the contract. If, on the other hand, they are not, then we would reject the bid as non-responsive and then go to the next lowest bid.
Speaking of good faith in section 1-301, what can we have a definition for good faith? To clarify what is meant in 1-103?
Absolutely. I say that, let me make sure I can talk to my friends in legal and confirm on all that, but that's a great suggestion.
Mhm. And then also, number 30, K12 Buy.
Mhm.
Is K12 Buy something that we procure? Is it, can you explain K12 Buy?
Sure. K12 Buy.
Because I know when I was an employee of the system, all of our vendors had to be a part of K12 Buy in order for us to do business with them.
Correct.
So could you explain it?
So K12 Buy is a software application, and what it does is it provides a user interface to the schools, very similar to if they were to go shop on the internet, for them to enter their information about what they want to buy, provide a quote from a vendor, attach those documents, select an account code, and then click submit. And when they click submit, K12 Buy interfaces with our financial system, confirms that funding is available, and then it goes to their supervisor for approval. Once approved by the supervisor, let's say a principal, then it would come into either procurement or to the next approver in the hierarchy. Ultimately, it'll go through procurement, where it'll be reviewed, and then a purchase order will be issued electronically to the vendor. All vendors are set up in our financial system, which is Oracle, in order for us to cut checks. And so K12 Buy interfaces with Oracle to confirm that goods are received, purchase orders are issued.
How much are we spending on K12 Buy? And is that, with your explanation, is that the best tool that we could use for a process like that?
It's a good tool. It's one we've used for, I want to say, maybe 12 years.
Are there other tools that exist like it?
There are other tools. They are typically integrated with other ERP systems. So, for example, Lawson, SAP, Workday, all of those, Oracle, et cetera, offer that type of integration now. I think what we're doing right now is we're looking at what we want to do with our current ERP system, and then making decisions about how we're going to bolt on or add other functions and features to it before we go any further.
So the ERP system first.
Yes. And so sort of a decision about whether or not we would continue to use K12 Buy would be made at that time.
Section 2, I just have a few more questions. Section 2-109. There's nothing in items 1, 2, or 3 that state the frequency of the reporting. Is the reporting on a cycle, is it dependent on when the procurement was made? A calendar cycle at the end of the contract or something else? And should that be articulated? For that reporting, should that be? What do you think?
Our experience has been is that the reporting is typically ad hoc. Because when schools or staff ask for information, typically it's very specific about, I'd like to understand the number of music programs, the number of music vendors we have. Where are those vendors providing services? What are the costs of those services? So we can typically provide those reports pretty much fairly easily at a pretty good level. I've created annual reports in the past. They don't get a lot of traction, What we do provide the board is every month, we provide a list of all of the vendors that we're doing business with, over $5,000 a year. And so if a community leader, member, the board, or anyone wish to understand more about how much business we're doing or what type of business we're doing with them, it'd be very easy for us to run those reports and provide them to you.
But they're not currently something that is made public generally. They're only available if asked for?
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Correct. We provide a high-level summary of all of the vendors that we're doing business with. But typically it spawns the question of, we're much more interested in how many vendors are providing student uniforms,
Mm-hmm.
and what are the costs for those uniforms, and what schools are buying those uniforms, and what account strings are paying for those uniforms.
Are the reports shared with the vendors to potentially improve their service with us?
So if a vendor asks us for the reports, we could provide them to them.
Mm-hmm.
The vendors also have access to the status of their transactions through K12 Buy. So if they want to know the status of a procurement, purchase, a receipt, et cetera, they can do that all online themselves.
Dr. Berkeley, do you have any questions?
No, and I'm sorry I was late, so I apologize to everyone. Thank you.
And the last four are also it's for section 5-106. For a point of clarity, are we saying that we can hire staff that work for us but represent the contractor or vendor? And is this a potential conflict of interest? This is section 5-106.
Right, you're speaking to the selection of on-call architects and engineers.
Mhm.
So what we do in this scenario is we issue a solicitation requesting vendors provide us their qualifications and credentials to provide either architect services,
Mhm.
engineering services, or construction management services. Those bios, if you will, are reviewed by the evaluation committee, and the evaluation committee determines which vendors they feel are most qualified to provide those services. We also have, as part of that process, we require that the vendors sign affidavits to confirm there's no collusion, bribery, affidavits, et cetera, to protect the school's interests. Once we've made a selection, let's say we've selected 10 architects and 10 engineers, we bring that list of vendors to the board for their review and approval. These contract amounts, this section also goes on to say that these are for procurements for $200,000 or less. Most architects and engineering services are below $200,000. They usually range from about $30,000 to $60,000. However, in those instances where it does exceed $200,000, the district is required to do a unique and single competitive solicitation for those design services. What we do, once we finalize the list of approved vendors, providers of these services, we then rotate. We have a list of all the vendors, the 10 architects in this example, and we'll just start at the top and go down to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, and rotate as the work becomes available. Most architect fees range from 6 to 9%.
Mm-hmm.
If they're found to be excessive, we negotiate those down.
Who serves on the review panel?
So typically, it would be facilities.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe the director of facilities and 2 or 3 of their project managers.
And how do they meet often, and how do they report to the board? Are they reporting to the board?
I'm not sure of your question.
So on the review panel, when does that review panel meet? And are they creating reports? They're meeting discussions. Does that need to come before the board? Should that come before the board?
So what they do is is that they receive all the bid responses from all the firms applying. They evaluate their responses in terms of references, creditworthiness, financial strength, previous project work, licenses, et cetera. And they'll rank them on a rubric from 0 to 10 in terms of, you did an excellent job, you didn't answer our questions well enough. Then they draw a line where they say, we want to take the top 10. We make recommendations. We then would send those recommendations down the MBE office to confirm that everything's compliant there. And then once that process is completed, we would then draft a board letter, and then we would come before the board and ask them to approve this list of 10 architects. And that's the opportunity for the board to ask questions about how did you go through your evaluation process? What experience do you have with these vendors, et cetera.
With Article 9, the authority to resolve protested solicitations and awards. And this is a general question, but is there a due process timeline associated with that?
So yes, it moves rather expeditiously, but with thought. The vendors, the way it would work, for example, is that the director, myself, would issue an intent to award letter. The intent to award letter goes out to everyone that responded to the solicitation, certified mail. The vendor receives the letter. If they feel that they're aggrieved in any way in the decision, then they have 5 days within which to file a protest. It then goes on to say that the director must, within 5 days of receipt, the director must, schedule a protest hearing for all matters to be heard. And so typically what happens is the vendor comes in, we have an informal conference where they state their reasons for their protest, we review it, we seek the advice of legal counsel.
Now they're coming in with you?
Yes,
Okay.
they come in and they have, typically I hear the protest. And then based on the merits of their protest, I either affirm the decision or not. That decision is made in writing. And then they have 5 days within which to respond to the decision of the director, or I'm actually acting as the CFO's designee as it pertains to this regulation.
Okay.
All right. And so so the next step in the process is if they still feel that they are aggrieved by the situation, then they have the opportunity to write written exceptions to the board. They have 10 days within which to do that. Typically, the director, myself, would also write commentary to the board explaining our position. Of course, this assumes that we're still at a conflict or disagreement as to the decision of the board. There are instances where the director has said, you're absolutely right with this protest, and it has ended, and we have reversed the decision and have issued a new solicitation.
Good to know. That's it for me. Okay. Well, thank you, Mr.
Great,
Parker.
thank you.
We received a written update on policy FFA, and that is the naming and renaming of a school program or facility. So hopefully we've gone through those. No public comment? I don't think that we have community members here. I think we're all staff. I think we're all friends. You want to talk to us about anything? Right. And so that's it for us. And I want to make sure that, for the record, there are a few things that I want to make sure that the community knows if they are watching. Our next meeting is of the Board's Policy Committee is January 15th, 2019, from 3:30 to 5:30 p.m. in this room. And the agenda items for that meeting are curriculum, conversion of Board Rule 702.02, and JJB, Policy JJB, sex-based discrimination, and a
Sorry, small correction. That should be JBB.
Thank you. JBB, Policy JBB, which is sex-based discrimination. And there'll be a board forum on Policy JBB immediately following the January Policy Committee meeting. As always, public comment is welcomed in the Policy Committee meetings. And Board Exec Grant, when should folks sign up if they wanted to speak for public comment prior to our committee meeting?
I think, Joe, can you scroll down? I believe that's on there, the procedures. Yeah, so.
I saw it somewhere, I can't find it.
Yeah, so they have until 5 p.m. Monday before the meeting date.
There it is.
5 p.m. Monday before the meeting day to sign up, and then if there's space, of course, we always welcome folks to speak if we have the time. That ends it for us. Chief of Staff, Allison, do you have anything to add for us? Great. Our policy committee meeting for today is adjourned at 4:07.
Again, sorry to be late.